Today, I want to take you back to a time before George Washington was a general, before he was a president, and long before his name became synonymous with American independence. I want to talk about a young, ambitious Virginian, barely out of his teens, who played a crucial role in the conflict we know as the French and Indian War. I will not pretend he was flawless. He made mistakes, some serious ones. But I will argue that his role in the French and Indian War was formative not only for his own character, but for the future leadership of the United States itself. If you want to understand Washington the revolutionary and Washington the president, you must first understand Washington, the provincial officer on the edge of empire. To begin, we need to understand the broader context. The French and Indian War, which began in North America in 1754 and merged into the global 7 Years' War by 1756, was fundamentally about empire. Britain and France were competing for control of North America, particularly the Ohio River Valley, an enormous fertile region critical for trade, settlement, and strategic dominance. Virginia's colonial elite, including the Washington family, had strong economic interests in this region. Land speculation was not a dirty word in the 18th century. It was a primary means of wealth and influence. Young George Washington, raised among the Virginia gentry, absorbed this worldview early. He was practical, ambitious, and intensely aware that opportunity lay westward. By his early 20s, Washington had already gained experience as a surveyor, a profession that demanded physical endurance, mathematical precision, and familiarity with the frontier. This experience would prove invaluable once war arrived. In 1753, when George Washington was just 21 years old, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, selected him for a dangerous diplomatic mission. French forces had begun constructing forts in the Ohio Valley, and Dinwiddie wanted a formal warning delivered: withdraw or face consequences. Let's pause here. The fact that Washington was chosen at such a young age tells us something important. He had already earned a reputation for competence, reliability, and physical toughness, qualities that mattered far more on the frontier than aristocratic pedigree. Washington traveled hundreds of miles through winter wilderness, negotiated with Native American leaders, and delivered the British ultimatum to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf. The French, politely but firmly, refused. Washington returned and wrote a detailed report of his journey. That report was published in both Virginia and London. Overnight, Washington became something of a minor celebrity within the British Empire. He had demonstrated poise, courage, and clarity under pressure. This was his first lesson in geopolitics. Empires do not retreat simply because you ask them to. The following year, Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel and sent back into the Ohio Valley with troops. Here we arrive at one of the most controversial moments of his early career, the Jumonville Glen incident in May 1754. Washington led a small force that surprised a French detachment. Shots were fired. The French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was killed, possibly after the fighting ended. The French later claimed Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission and accused Washington of assassination. Let me be clear with you as historians, the truth here is murky. Frontier warfare was chaotic, multilingual, and culturally complex. Native American allies played decisive roles, and misunderstandings were common. What matters is this: this skirmish effectively ignited the French and Indian War. A 22-year-old George Washington had helped light the fuse of a global conflict. Now, critics sometimes freeze Washington in this moment and label him reckless. That is too easy. What we should see instead is a young officer operating under unclear orders, in hostile territory, facing an enemy that had already violated British claims. War on the frontier rarely resembled clean textbook scenarios. Soon after Jumonville Glen, Washington constructed a crude defensive position known as Fort Necessity. It was poorly placed, low ground, vulnerable to flooding, and surrounded by forest. The French counterattacked in July 1754. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Washington was forced to surrender. This was, without question, a defeat. Worse still, the surrender document, written in French, contained language that appeared to admit Washington had assassinated Jumonville. Washington later claimed he did not understand the wording. This moment matters deeply. Why? Because Washington learned something that too few leaders ever learn early enough. Failure can be a teacher. He learned about the dangers of overconfidence. He learned the limits of colonial militias. He learned the importance of logistics, terrain, and professional discipline. Most importantly, he learned humility. These lessons stayed with him for life. In 1755, Washington joined the staff of British General Edward Braddock. This was a crucial turning point. Braddock represented the British regular army, professional, disciplined, and utterly contemptuous of colonial advice. Washington warned Braddock that European tactics were ill-suited for North American forests. Braddock ignored him. The result was catastrophic. Near the Monongahela River, French and Native American forces ambushed the British column. The regulars panicked. Officers fell. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Washington distinguished himself magnificently. He rode back and forth through gunfire, rallying troops, delivering orders, and organizing a retreat. 2 horses were shot out from under him. 4 bullets tore through his coat. He was not wounded. Even his enemies took notice. Some Native American warriors later claimed they believed Washington was protected by Providence. From this moment on, Washington's reputation was secure. He had demonstrated coolness under fire, personal bravery, and leadership in the face of chaos. After Braddock's defeat, Washington was appointed commander of all Virginia forces, an enormous responsibility for a man in his early 20s. He spent the next several years defending Virginia's long frontier against raids and attacks. This was not glorious warfare. It involved shortages, desertions, political infighting, and constant frustration with colonial legislatures that failed to supply troops adequately. Yet Washington persevered. He drilled his men. He enforced discipline. He worked tirelessly with limited resources. Here, Washington learned another vital lesson: civilian control of the military. He chafed at interference from politicians, but he obeyed them. That habit would later define his presidency. By the time the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Washington had gained something priceless: real combat experience, a deep understanding of British military strengths and weaknesses, a lasting skepticism of aristocratic pretensions, and an unshakable belief that colonial Americans could lead themselves. He also developed a lifelong resentment toward British condescension toward colonial officers. Despite his service, Washington was repeatedly denied a commission in the regular British Army, something granted easily to men of lesser ability but higher social rank in Britain. This grievance would later align with broader colonial frustrations. Let me close with this thought. The French and Indian War did not make George Washington famous in the way the Revolution would, but it made him capable. It forged his character. It disciplined his ambition. It taught him patience, endurance, and restraint. When the American Revolution came, Washington did not enter it as a naive idealist. He entered it as a man who understood war's cost, its uncertainty, and its moral weight. And that, students, is why the French and Indian War matters, not just as a prelude to the Revolution, but as the crucible in which America's indispensable man was formed. Thank you.